and of sharing her large, complicated, unique, beautiful story with anyone who comes to Boston. My hope is that the Lioness of Boston reveals and continues her story. Today, we see Isabella Stewart Gardner as a trailblazer, a collector of diverse works, an art philanthropist with an eye to making all of that art accessible to the public. We see her as a woman unafraid of controversy, brave enough not only to speak her mind on the role of women in society and within art, but brave enough also, if rumor holds, to walk a pair of lions around the Boston streets.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society, and the Boston Public Library, ably produced by GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors, NEHGS, and a producer of this series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history, looking at Boston in the 19th century and its famous resident, the impactful Isabella Stewart Gardner. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event centered on the new novel, The Lioness of Boston, by Emily Franklin. After some brief remarks and sharing just a few images, Ms. Franklin will be joined by moderator Claire Messud. For more about this evening and Emily Franklin, over to you, Kristen from the Boston Public Library.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And on behalf of the Boston Public Library, welcome. As Margaret said, I'm Kristen Motti. I'm the programs librarian at the Central Library. We're thrilled to be here this evening with you and with NEHGS and the GBH Forum Network, and also our featured author and moderator. I have the honor this evening now just to tell you a little bit about tonight's featured guest author. Emily Franklin is the author of more than 20 novels and a poetry collection, Tell Me How You Got Here. Her award-winning work has appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Guernica, JAMA, and numerous literary magazines, as well as featured and read aloud on NPR and named notable by the Association of Jewish Libraries. She is a lifelong visitor to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum here in Boston, and we'll meet Emily in just a moment. But first, to tell us a little bit about tonight's moderator, Claire Messud. Margaret, back over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. We are also delighted to welcome as tonight's moderator, Claire Messud. Ms. Messud is the author of 6 novels, including The Emperor's Children, The Woman Upstairs, and The Burning Girl. Her 7th novel, titled This Strange Eventful History, will be published in 2024. Claire Messud is the Joseph Y. Bay and Janice Lee Senior Lecturer on Fiction at Harvard University in the Department of English. Claire has been with us a few times in this series, and we are really delighted to have her back. We thank her. For now, though, to start us off, Emily, a hearty welcome to you. I said previously that you're local to Boston, but as you and I discussed today, you're really now all over the country talking about this fabulous book, traveling to New York tomorrow and also later to Philadelphia. So truly, we're also lucky to have you here tonight.
Well, thank you. I am doing a lot of traveling. I've been so lucky that the book has struck a chord with book groups, especially. I love hearing from them. And the book's actually going to its 4th printing. So thank you.
Oh, that is so exciting, a 4th printing. You just rarely hear that these days. So many books get overshot large, and that's just, I'm so happy for you. As a Boston girl, myself and you, and also Claire, we were all same high school. I'm really thrilled for you. And we are really looking forward to hearing more about the Lioness of Boston. We're also looking forward to hearing from both of you about writing fiction, which is both of your specialty. I mean, you both touched down in history, and Claire has touched down in memoir before, but truly, we look forward to hearing about the life of Isabella Stewart Gardner. So over to you.
Thanks so much for hosting me tonight, Margaret and Kristen. Thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks in advance to Claire Messud, with whom I'll obviously be speaking shortly. It's a real thrill for me to be here, and such a journey from my first visits to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. You can see behind me, I'm actually inside the cover of my book, thanks to the wonders of technology. So if you see me and it looks like I'm floating in space, rest assured I'm actually in a real room, but it's one of my kids' rooms, so it's better that you see me in the book. Anyway, I'm so happy to be able to share this fascinating woman with all of you. So some of you may have visited the famous Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, but for those who are not familiar, this is a stunning Venetian-style palace right in the heart of Boston. When I first visited as a child, I thought the place was magic. I marveled at the museum's interior courtyard with its bright orchids and clusters of calla lilies. You know, for the first time, the boundaries between the outside world and the inside world seemed to disappear. I wandered the vast rooms. The Isabella Stewart Gardner has not only an astonishing array of masterworks of art, but also antique chairs. Truly, there's a lot of chairs in that place. Everything from priceless Duncan Fife chairs to simple metal garden chairs. And the museum is filled with vases, rare books, tapestries, writing desks, andirons as tall as I am, ornate tiles, and even a lock of Robert Browning's hair. And what I understood, even from that very first time I explored the museum, was that this museum was a different kind of place. Its collection suggested that anything could be art, which was a complete reframe for my young mind. And then as a senior in 1990, I was in high school and we went on a field trip to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and I sat in the cavernous Dutch room and I studied the weighty artwork, and I wrote a paper about Rembrandt's Storm in the Sea of Galilee and Vermeer's The Concert. 10 days later, those paintings were cut from their frames, stolen in one of the largest art heists in history. Even today, those frames remain empty, a marker of hope for their safe return, but also because, and I will address this a little bit later, Isabella Stewart Gardner made sure nothing in her museum could ever be moved and nothing could ever be changed. There's a lot of focus now on the infamous art heist at the Gardner Museum, but I was really fascinated with the woman who built it. In my book, The Lioness of Boston, Isabella says we are all born at the wrong time. And I think this is certainly how she felt, at least at the beginning. She really was ahead of her time, forward-thinking, and in many ways initially misunderstood. And eventually she became a Boston celebrity before celebrity culture. So a lot of Bostonians know more about the artwork housed at the museum than about who Isabella Stewart Gardner was and how she came to be the first woman to open a museum in the United States, paving the way for other museum creators such as Peggy Guggenheim. I'll tell you a little bit more about her. Isabella Stewart was born in 1840 into a wealthy Scottish family in New York. They made their money mainly importing linen from Ireland. Isabella went to finishing school in Paris, and while she was there, she befriended Bostonian Julia Gardner. When spirited Isabella came to Boston to visit Julia after their time in Paris, she met Julia's brother, the very eligible John Jack Lowell Gardner, and a couple of years later, they got married. Isabella Stewart Gardner moved to Boston when she was only 20 years old, and she hoped to settle into Boston life, living with her new husband on Beacon Street in a home given to them by Isabella's father. Their house was in Back Bay, an area of Boston which had been swampland and only recently filled in, just in time for Jack and Isabella to lead the way for other high society families to move into the neighborhood. So Isabella arrived to Boston with her usual enthusiasm and high hopes, but Boston did not embrace Isabella Stewart Gardner. Boston was a very closed society at that time. The old guard families were a group author physician Oliver Wendell Holmes had termed Brahmins in his 1861 book, which is the same year that The Lioness of Boston begins. So Belle, as Isabella was called then, tried very hard to fit into Brahmin life. She really wanted to belong, but she also had her opinions and she wasn't shy about expressing them. Her outspoken nature and her unique style did not sit well with more formal Bostonians. Ostracized by women for her lack of social grace and by men for having views on matters that really should have only been the purview of her husband, Isabella struggled to fulfill the role given to her. She was determined and she kept trying despite her social rejections, thinking acceptance in society would give her satisfaction. But after personal tragedy, she lost her only child and found she would never be able to bear more children. Isabella sank into a deep depression. Without family and without social acceptance, what purpose did Isabella have? On the advice of their family physician, Dr. Bigelow, Jack took her on the first of what would be many, and I mean many, many trips abroad. As Isabella's world expanded with this travel, her natural personal curiosity connected her to people and to places. And she had a growing intellectual curiosity that really reached a turning point when she met Charles Eliot Norton, who would become the first professor of art history at Harvard. And later he included her in his new Dante Society. The more Isabella Stewart Gardner learned, the more exposure she had to Cambridge intellectual life, the more she seemed to become herself. Not only was she attending all-male Harvard lectures as a woman, she was collecting information, and importantly, she was beginning to collect people, becoming friends with artists and writers, people who were maybe different in some way and who were often overlooked by society the way she had been. With encouragement from Norton, Isabella Stewart Gardner began collecting rare books. She had an eye for beauty, for potential worth, and for elevating even a book of fairy tales to valuable collection status. Eventually, she would have more than 1,500 rare books. As this journey progressed, she also began to amass art and architectural objects, and she sponsored one of Norton's students, Jewish immigrant Harvard student Bernard Berenson, who would go on to become one of the most famous art historians in the world. Isabella's life, which was really once lonely and marked by tragedy, became populated by an incredible array of artists and intellectuals, those who, unlike the people she'd been rejected by earlier, really adored her and understood her lively, outspoken nature. One of these was Henry James, with whom she formed a very close friendship. They exchanged letters for more than 40 years. And another was painter John Singer Sargent, and another Julia Ward Howe, who wrote Battle Hymn of the Republic and who became her neighbor on Beacon Street. Isabella traveled the world. She went to Europe, Asia, she even camped in the Middle East, but she returned most often to the Palazzo Barbaro in Venice, which held for her a sense of beauty and calm she carried with her forever. In The Lioness of Boston, as Isabella comes into her own and finds her life's purpose in collecting, Boston is also transforming and becoming the city it is today. So in the novel's pages, we see the building of the Natural History Museum, read about the geographical complexities of Boston's elite Beacon Hill, positioned high above, in contrast to the African-American Meeting House, which was there since 1806. We learn about Rebecca Lee Crumpler, the first African-American woman to earn an MD in the US. We witness the opening of Boston's beloved Swan Boats in 1877, read about the first Boston Symphony Orchestra performance in October of 1881, and through Isabella Stewart Gardner's eyes, we get to experience Frederick Law Olmsted's public gardens and Arnold Arboretum. And of course, by the end of the novel, spoiler alert, we also understand Isabella's personal lasting contribution to Boston history. So when Isabella's father died in 1891, Isabella, who outlived her siblings, inherited his money and began using those funds to acquire significant works of art: Rembrandt, Vermeer, Botticelli, Manet, and others, including Swedish artist Anders Zorn, who she discovered at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. She acquired not only paintings, but architectural pieces, and soon the Beacon Street house was too small to contain her ideas and her art. So Jack, ever her loving husband, broke through to the house next door, and soon those walls also filled. Isabella really delighted in hosting soirees there and lectures with Harvard professors there and nights of orchestra music in her house. And as she kept growing her personal collection, she decided that the works belonged in a place larger than her Beacon Street home. So she chose as the location the Back Bay Fens, which was then considered an urban wild area, which was part of Frederick Law Olmsted's Emerald Necklace Park system. So again, Boston did not understand what Isabella Stewart Gardner was up to, but even though she faced some scorn for that, she planned to open a house museum with a structure inspired by her beloved Palazzo Barbaro in Venice. Isabella was nearly 60 years old when she broke ground on that building site. The architectural pieces she'd bought would be used as structural elements for the interior courtyard of her museum. Architect Willard Sears was surprised and not entirely pleased to find how big a hand Isabella wanted to have in the creation of her house museum. In fact, Isabella went each day to the building site carrying her own lunch pail and often asked that certain elements be moved or redone. Isabella Stewart Gardner found meaning in her life by sharing her love of art. With Bernard Berenson's help as her advisor, she created an extraordinary collection. Titian's Rape of Europa is among the 7,500 works of art in her collection. John Singer Sargent, who I mentioned was a very close friend of hers, painted her portrait more than once, including Isabella in an elegant black dress that Boston deemed too risque and which caused further social scandal. Yet this scandal did not deter Isabella from her ultimate goal, which was to make art accessible to the public. Isabella Stewart Gardner became a living legend in 1903 when she opened her Italian palazzo-style home, then called Fenway Court, as a museum showcasing her collection of old masters, antiques, and objects. After her death in 1924, Fenway Court became known as the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. The New York Times called the museum Boston's beloved temple to idiosyncrasy. Aside from her artistic vision and arrangements of chairs, desks, ceramics, master paintings, and Byzantine stonework all arranged side by side, the Gardner Museum is famous because Isabella's legacy requires that nothing in the collection ever be moved and that no new works be brought in. Gardner's will states that if the arrangement of any of the museum's holdings changes, the entire collection, the building, and even the land beneath it must be turned over to Harvard. Sometimes I'm asked if this was self-centered on Isabella Stewart Gardner's part or merely quirky. And I know that Isabella wasn't an artist, but in The Lioness of Boston, I wrote that it's clear to me that the museum she created is a huge work of art made out of other people's works of art. I think she felt the museum was her masterpiece. And so to move any of its parts would be to undo the artwork she had created. Guy de Maupassant wrote, "Our memory is a more perfect world than the universe. It gives back life to those who no longer exist." As a writer, I've always been fascinated with memory. And one way we ascribe meaning to people and to events is to remember them. In writing The Lioness of Boston, this theme of memory and meaning was there right at the beginning. Isabella's directive shows someone who is determined to keep everything as it was, someone who was resolved both to have their vision shared with others and also in some way to be remembered themselves, and to be remembered specifically in the way that she had arranged. So art is another way to be remembered or to fix a particular moment in time. And for Isabella Stewart Gardner, art and objects were also a way of storytelling and of sharing her large, complicated, unique, beautiful story with anyone who comes to Boston. My hope is that The Lioness of Boston reveals and continues her story. Today, we see Isabella Stewart Gardner as a trailblazer, a collector of diverse works, an art philanthropist with an eye to making all of that art accessible to the public. We see her as a woman unafraid of controversy, brave enough not only to speak her mind on the role of women in society and within art, but brave enough also, if rumor holds, to walk a pair of lions around the Boston streets. Boston Press wrote, "Isabella is one of the 7 wonders of Boston, and there is nobody like her in any city in this country." The Lioness of Boston delves deeply into Isabella and Boston's connected histories. The novel is really about what society expected a woman's life to be and how Isabella rebelled and determined to live life on her own terms. And if anyone tonight is watching with the name Isabella, you can rest assured she made an allowance for you and you have a lifetime free admission to the museum. Of course, Isabella didn't make allowances for Emily's or Claire's, but I'm excited to welcome Claire Messud to this event. Thanks so much for joining me, Claire.
Thank you, Emily, for that wonderful presentation. And for your wonderful novel. It's been such a joy reading it, and I'm so thrilled to have the chance to talk to you about it. I have so many questions, and we also have many questions from the audience already, but I thought maybe you might start by, I know you're a lifelong Bostonian, you're a lifelong visitor to the museum. But what was it? When was the moment that you thought, you've written many novels, but not before a historical novel?
Yeah.
And you didn't sort of, pick to choose to write about an obscure or fictional, 19th century person living their quiet life where you could make up everything. You instead you gravitated to this amazing woman with an extraordinary and also very public history. And I wonder if you'd talk a little about how that came about and how you then embarked on it.
Sure. I think so. As I said, I am a lifelong visitor to the museum, and I was actually researching a different novel probably 10 years ago. And I kept going back to the museum. There was a scene that was set a little bit during the heist. And as I kept wandering around, I was, remembering my fascination with the place as a child and as a young person. And during the heist, as I said, since I was there right before the paintings were stolen. And I was so captivated by the empty frames. Because as a writer, of course, there's a great metaphor there, right? So if MoMA has a valuable piece of art that's stolen, the case that it was in or the space that it had on the wall, it's covered up or the case is removed, and we sort of forget what happened. But because these frames are forever on the walls, it's impossible to forget what happened. And so the metaphor there for a writer, of course, is that we all experience loss of some kind, and we carry those empty frames with us. So I kept picturing these empty frames and thinking about the woman who demanded that the empty frames still stay there, and what that meant for her in her life. What emptiness and what loss did she carry? And she was just a sort of a wacky, outrageous, interesting, fascinating woman. And I would come home and talk to my husband and remind him of how fascinating she was. And I would say, somebody should write a novel about her. And then I thought, oh, wait a minute, I write novels. I could write a novel about her. So, but of course, you're right. It is my first historic novel. It won't be my last. But what happened was, and why I chose to go forward with it, is nobody had written a novel about her life before. There had been biographies and sort of companion pieces with nonfiction books about her life, but nobody had really taken this big, deep historic dive into the rich history of Boston at the time and all of the people that she encountered. And so I felt like it was a real opportunity to explore that. And I know that, it's a choice. There's the choice of, I've been asked before, why did I write a novel instead of a biography? And I am 100% not the person to write a biography, because I like to make stuff up. And so I fear that I would have people on the page saying things that they didn't really say, which in a novel you're allowed to do. Like I always think of that Camus quote, fiction is the lie through which we tell the truth. And so what I really wanted to do was get to the heart of her character and get to the heart of the outrageous personality and balance that with, I think, her inner loss and her inner sadness, and get to display that on the page.
And which you absolutely do. I think one of the things for me as there's so much in this novel, and from the food and the slang expressions of the time, and as well as all the vivid and amazing characters, but some of those things might have been found in a biography. But what you create here is her voice, and we're with her, and she's so compelling and immediate. She's a character from the very beginning that we want to that we want to travel with through her life. That to me seems such a magical achievement, because it isn't. I mean, she is a woman of a different century, of a different forgive me, you may have aristocratic blood, but I feel like of a different sort of social world than any of us inhabits now, and yet you got so close to her, and you got into her, and I wondered whether that was something that came from archival research, or a leap of imagination, or some combination of the two. How did you find her voice?
Well, so I grew up half in Boston and half in London, and definitely the London part helps with a little bit of the cadence and some of the language choices, and I guess the sort of maybe European mentality that she had. I am definitely not aristocratic, definitely not blue blood. So that was very fun to inhabit. And part of that is the research, and part of that, I was always like a nerdy, researchy kid. I mean, and also I was the kid who would willingly sit at the grandparent table. I always wanted to ask, questions and stories and hear about life from another time that I would never live in. And So I always saw, or I would look at photo albums with my grandparents and really wanted to know all of the details. They always thought it was really strange that I would want to know, how ice got delivered and, all of those things. But I really wanted to be able to imagine that world that they had lived in. And I think I did the same thing with Isabella, of really trying to, instead of looking at a sepia, black and white photograph of her, really try to think about, what did the fabric feel like on her body? How did you sit in a chair if you had a bustle? And so to really make it feel like a lived-in world as opposed to a researched world. I mean, it was very carefully and thoroughly researched, but definitely much more sensory. And I wanted it to feel very real. These are people who lived hundreds of years ago, but they had the same desires and sadnesses and lusts and, funny moments that we have now. And I think that was the key for me to make it feel real.
Mm-hmm. Which it so does. And what about the historical research? Did she leave? There are many letters in this book. Are any of them actually her letters, or did you?
Yeah, 100% of the letters in this novel are made up.
Right, 100% of the letters are made up. So what did you have I mean, obviously there were history books and and so on, but did she leave? What did she leave, or did others leave about her that that you could turn to find the details of her life?
I mean, she was a very good letter writer. So there are these 40, you can still buy the complete letters that she exchanged with Henry James. Lots of letters she exchanged with Bernard Berenson. These are big, thick doorstop books you can still get. So that was good. The ones with Berenson are part sort of narrative and part really just talking about the acquisition of the art. And so that's fascinating in its own way, or telegrams about which pieces she wanted to acquire, and how she was going to do that. But in terms of what was left behind, I mean, the great blessing of writing about her is that she really didn't leave she didn't leave journals. She was not a great diary keeper, which is actually a great blessing for a fiction writer. I think you would probably agree, where I could have more freedom to create a voice. And the letters I wanted to create because there was mail being delivered sometimes thrice daily,
Right.
And so this was a huge way that everybody made and sustained friendships and relationships and communicated. And I was a prolific letter writer all throughout. I'm so sad that it's such a dying art these days, but I loved letter writing, and I wanted to be able also with a first person narrative to be able to give a little bit of space. So you can hear Julia's voice, you could hear the zookeeper's voice, you can hear other people, John Singer Sargent, people who are writing letters, even Henry James. Henry James left a lot of letters, but I wanted to capture moments that I was putting into the book myself and not have to retrofit a scene by what was available from research.
Mm-hmm. That leads me to another question, which is about how you set for yourself parameters about what, where you felt constrained by the facts of history, where you felt the fluidity of things that were bruited about but not known. For example, her affair with Crawford. I think that was it was whispered about at the time, but it's not. I think I'm right that it wasn't recorded. Like there's no sort of
there's speculation. We don't know, and so the simplest way to answer that is so much of the novel is real. I really stuck true to the timeline, to the backbone of her life. There's really nothing major that happens that didn't happen to her. And anytime I strayed away, and I'll give you an example, anytime I strayed away from truth, it's really in service to the fact that I was writing a novel, so it needs to have an arc and it needs to be page turning, and also in service to the character that I was writing, which is Isabella Stewart Gardner was obviously a real person, and we can speculate as much as we want about the kind of person she was based on her escapades, based on narratives based on letters, but none of us have ever met her. So even biographers are doing the best they can do with their careful research. And this was the best I could do with my particular lens. If you wrote a novel about her, she might have different characteristics. You might shine a spotlight on her faith, or the role of her as a daughter. I really don't go into that very much. So this was my particular lens, and I had to both sort of narrow my lens onto her and try to figure out where my boundaries were. And so in terms of other boundaries, I never would want, and this sounds ridiculous, but it's a historic group here. So the zipper does not appear until the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. I would never have a zipper in the book before 1893, because that would just be annoying. If you knew that the zipper, didn't appear in the world until then, that would be frustrating to have it appear, in 1861 when the book starts. So I always stay true to that sort of thing. But there's a scene, for example, midway through the novel, takes place in Paris, and it's set during the first Impressionist exhibit. And the Impressionists were not even called the Impressionist at this point. They're just called this sort of anonymous painting society. And everybody you can think of, the scene unfolds in the book very much the way it did in real life. So it's truly at Nadar's studio. He was a photographer at the time in Paris, and Monet is there, and Manet, and Renoir, and Pissarro, and Degas, and Bertha Morisot, and everybody is there. And Isabella was in Paris at the time, but she didn't actually attend that show. I had her attend the show in the novel, which was, again, this is a good example of the choices. And I had to do that, I felt, both because it's such a fascinating show and scenes to create that maybe people don't know about, that this is how the Impressionists got started. This was a group, they were all together at the same time. But the main reason I had her go is because of all the people that I just named. I'm fairly sure that the many, many people who are on this webinar, that we all collectively know the least about Bertha Morisot. And the reason we know the least about her is because she was the only woman. And that is the only reason we don't know as much about her. And so I needed Isabella, who was beginning to question the role of women and question the role of women in art. I needed to have her interact with people who were actually experiencing this, so that she could then, as a character, begin to build. We know the woman she became, because that's what we're left with. We're left with the museum as our best piece of evidence and our best research facility. But we don't know all the breadcrumb trail for how she got to be there. So I have to, as a novelist, really build in. I can't just have her arrive and be like, well, this was my life and now I'm opening a museum. We have to show how she got there. And so it seemed like a good choice to make that. So it was the combination of fact and fiction in that particular chapter.
Absolutely. This makes me think of another question that I had, that I was so struck by. I think before I read the novel, I don't know what I imagined the arc would be, but I didn't imagine perhaps how closely we would see that evolution from a daunted and hurt, in fact, young woman who is trying, well, she's not willing to not be herself, but she's trying pretty hard to fit in her early days in Boston, and is stung by rejection upon rejection. And in fact, the arc is from that person to the self-possessed, erudite, cosmopolitan, confident person who is directing Sears as he creates her masterpiece for her, but it's interesting how late in the novel she becomes the Isabella Stewart Gardner that insofar as I knew about Isabella Stewart Gardner, I mean, the person that I imagined her to be. And I love that. I feel as though, actually, I said earlier, you didn't choose a sort of ordinary, invisible protagonist from the 19th century. But for me as a reader, part of what what draws me in. I mean, I would be drawn in no matter what. It's Isabella Stewart Gardner, but novelistically, what's drawing me in, I think, is this sense of her as a vulnerable person who then, of course, suffers the tragedy of the loss. First, the difficulty of having a child, and then the loss of her child. But was that something you knew from the beginning? This is the arc that Isabella Stewart Gardner, the collector, will be only the last third of the novel. Did you know that?
Well, I think I had a decent sense of that, just because, again, that's what we think of, that's what we know. And so what don't we know? We don't know all the other stuff. And really, again, none of us arrive in the second half of our lives as fully formed. There's a reason why we are the way we are. So she's always referring to the earlier selves. And I wanted to show those earlier selves. You asked how I found her voice, and the first line of the novel is the first line that I wrote, which is, as you know, sometimes unusual for a novel. Sometimes you write and you get rid of the beginning, or the beginning moves to the middle. And so the prologue was the first that I wrote of the book, and it stayed the prologue pretty much exactly as I wrote it. And I knew that older, wiser voice was going to be present. What I didn't know was that the older, wiser voice would come back in between each, book that's within the novel. I didn't know exactly what the pacing would be, what you're talking about, which was, I didn't know if we would spend the second half of the novel with the museum. But really, as I began to research and write, I wanted to be able to really honor the long life that she led. As I said, she didn't break ground on the museum until she was 60. So if I really just sort of skimmed over the first 60 years and then started at the museum, it doesn't seem right. I think that, I really wanted to delve into some of the harder issues that she experienced, some of the losses that she had, and this incredible intellectual awakening that she had, which was very unusual for the time, and very unusual even for her elevated social circle.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm mindful of the time, and in just a few minutes we'll turn. There are many questions from the audience, and I want to be sure to try to get in as many as possible. But I want to just maybe first to ask you, just because I'm curious, what if you might be able to say what was most difficult, and what you enjoyed most in writing the novel?
What was most difficult was actually cutting pages. So this is, it's a chunky book. It's I think 375 pages, something like that. But it was 500 something pages when I first finished it. And that kind of cutting is really hard. Not because I was so attached to every word, but because there are people that Isabella got to meet that I had to take out just because I didn't have the space. And I really wanted to make it more suitable for book groups and things like that, people who may not want to read a 500-page novel. So that was a really hard thing for me, was to cut. But my editor was extremely skilled with that and very helpful. And so I let go of that. And my favorite part was, I guess, just spending time with this person who obviously I'm never going to meet, but really also learning all the people that she became friends with. She really made, I like to think of it as a lunch table for herself. I picture her at the beginning of the book, and she has her lunch tray in the cafeteria, and she had this, obviously there was no cafeteria then, but this is the metaphor, that she had no one to sit with. She really was friendless. And by the end of her life, she has collected an incredible array of friends, all these people who loved her, and such an amazing group of artists and writers and people who also maybe didn't have a lunch table, and that became part of her museum of friendship. And so that was really a special thing for me to bear witness to and to write about.
That's wonderful. Thank you. It makes me, there's a moment when Oscar Wilde says to her in the novel, groups don't form from the ether. It's a decisive act. And it's the first time that she thinks to herself that you have the line, for all the circles in which I had not felt welcome, it had not dawned on me that I might create my own. And that's a sort of turning point in the novel, where she already has relationships with a number of these people, but she goes forward thinking of that as in a different way, with agency, with an agency.
Yeah, with agency. That's what I was, trying to put words to for her, which is what I believe how she ended up moving through her life as she aged.
Right. And in that sense, the novel is so contemporary. I mean, I feel it speaks so much to a contemporary time, even though it's, and just another aside, it may come up in the questions that we're going through, but Boston and those characters, Boston is a character also. I mean, you spoke to that in your presentation at the beginning, and about the evolution of Boston through the novel. But as somebody who's lived here a long time, who went to high school here, and I felt that the city itself is so much at the heart of this wonderful novel, and she too makes her peace with it in the end.
Yes, they have this contentious relationship, but I think eventually they come to an understanding and eventually love each other.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe now we'll turn to some of the many questions. There are lots of them. Here's a question maybe to start about her relationship with Bernard Berenson. Would you tell us a little bit about him and how they came to work together, and then the specific question is also, what is your view that Berenson took advantage of her and overcharged her for works of art, and also that some of them were not of the best quality? I guess that is one account that has been raised about that relationship.
Okay. And I can't really speak to that so much, but I will say that, so she did sponsor, she meets Berenson through Charles Eliot Norton and sponsors him. Bernard Berenson didn't know exactly what he was going to go do. So Isabella would give him money the way that arts patrons did at that time, and sort of said, go off and explore the world and think about what you want to do. She knew he was very smart and very driven. And he went off to Europe and with an eye towards art. And when he begins to be an art advisor, specifically to Isabella, they already have a trusted friendship. It was very much sort of, mentor mentee, although she wasn't an expert in the field that he was going into, but, he would write to her. Those letters do exist, as I said, and they just had a very nice friendship. And I don't know whether I don't know what he, if he overcharged her for things. All I know is that in the letters, it's very clear he is finding works that we know are valuable. When he's asking, does she want this Botticelli? I don't believe that he overcharged her for Botticelli, but at the same time, I wasn't alive at the time. I don't know what she ought to have paid. He did take a commission. He did make his money that way. At the same time, Isabella wasn't saying to him, I can't afford this Botticelli. How can you charge me for this? So they seemed to have a really nice rapport, and he did have an eye towards what she wanted. And so in many ways was her art scout. And so it was a working relationship, but also a deep, long-lasting friendship.
I wonder, because it was something I was struck by that you handled so deftly in the novel. I wonder if you wanted to say anything about his Jewishness, especially in the context of Boston of the time, because it's something that there's some sort of darker moments in the novel.
Yeah, he definitely experienced anti-Semitism. We know this. We know this both in the art world, in the Harvard world, even within Isabella's family and social circle. There were comments made, and there were comments made about money and all sorts of things. And Isabella really defended him. And one of the things that I think maybe is a modern lens to look at, but I do think she was sort of an early ally for people. So I think people who were different, whether they, were Jewish or gay or just overlooked in some way, I think she was a great champion of people who felt different. I think she felt different, even though she was born into privileged and lived in a privileged society. So in terms of his Judaism, I think she, supported that.
And what about that, for Isabella Stewart Gardner's relation as a sort of proto-feminist? She had a lot, he was one of her social group had a lot of men in it, and she was often seen, out on, speaking to men in groups with men. That was a little scandalous, I guess. Was it? Or
I think it was scandalous. To be fair, I don't think there was much romance happening in there. I think many of the men were more interested in other men romantically, but she did really like the male intellectual world. And I think what started her being friends with men was feeling that she had been rejected from these sewing circles, from this from the social part of the female-driven world of Boston. Initially anyway. And so she really found that she had more to talk about issues with the intellectual people she was meeting through Charles Eliot Norton, and then the artists she was beginning to meet, John Singer Sargent and Whistler and other people. And so that was an easier way for her to form long-lasting friendships than the sort of social chit-chat that she always failed at. She was not a good traditional dinner party guest. She spoke out of turn. She spoke too deeply or not enough. And so I think if you fail enough times at something, the natural instinct is to go towards the success, which was she had success talking and spending time with men. But then later on, she becomes friends with, Julia Ward Howe and Maud Howe was their daughter, and Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields. There are a lot of other women that she becomes friends with, mainly writers and some artists.
I was struck and quite moved by your portrait of Jack, her husband, who wasn't an intellectual and probably was a little baffled in moments, but and sometimes we know was disapproving, certainly of the portrait of the Sargent portrait of her. He was disapproving, but they had a good relationship anyway.
They did. I think marriage is part based on love and part based on tolerance. And I think that what drew Isabella to Jack in the first place, I imagine, is that he was very solid and dependable and kind. And what drew him to her was she was exciting and lively and a little different, and all of those, and both of those things in each of the other person can also be very annoying as you get decades into a marriage. And he might have been thinking, why can't she just not talk? Why does she have to be so lively all the time? And then maybe she was thinking, why are you so dull? Why are you so dependable? Couldn't you be a little bit less, predictable? So, our strengths are our challenges. And so, but I do think they had a very long and loving marriage, and they really stuck by each other. So, I think it's important to get all of that on the page.
For me, I had in mind Edith Wharton, who was was younger, but a sort of near contemporary, and whose marriage did not serve that, was not like that. It didn't work out. So, who had her scandalous divorce. So there, I feel there are many questions and there's not a huge amount of time, but one of the questions is how much of your research was done at the Gardner Museum, and how closely did you work with the curators and archivists in developing your novel? And what was
I didn't work with them in developing the novel at all, but the archivist is very good. If I had a particular question, I got nice responses. But the truth is, I did spend some time there just because I think being in the physical space was so important. And just the feeling of being, again, near the courtyard or in the Yellow Room or in the Dutch Room. And then, but really their online their website is phenomenal. And so what I really used it the most for was to look up the provenance of specific items. And it was always a happy day for me when there was an item such as the perfume vial. There's a double-ended perfume vial that I write about in the novel of unknown provenance. And that was the best, because when we don't know exactly how she came about having it, I can write a scene completely free. But sometimes it was great because if I knew that she was, when exactly she got a specific rare book, I could also write a scene around that. So there's a book in her collection that I created a scene in one of the old Boston bookstores. And so that's what I mainly used the museum for, and obviously studying the art and researching the art there too.
And this question, just for fun, what of the artworks in that museum would you want to have for yourself?
No. I have been asked that a couple of times, and the first time it really caught me off guard, but then I realized then the other part of my brain said, you know exactly what you would want. If I could own one thing, and I do write about this painting in there, Dodge McKnight, who there's a whole Dodge McKnight room. He was an artist, he and Van Gogh painted together in Europe. But he actually settled down on the Cape, and in Sandwich, they actually have, in the Sandwich Library, there are some of his original works, but there's a painting of Dodge McKnight's called The Bay, and it's just shockingly rich colors. And I know it's actually a beach in France, but I like to think it's the coast of Massachusetts. And I just love that, the painting so much. So that's,
did you know it all your life, or is it one that you came to?
When I came to writing this book, I really just sort of refound it. Maybe I saw it as a child and re-saw it as an adult, but yeah, I was completely struck by it.
Thank you. And here's I think it's soon time to turn it over to you but here's a question on a slightly different, broader topic. What is the best piece of writing advice that you have ever received, and is that you still use, or that you use in your work? I know that's a tough one, maybe.
No, that is a tough one, but actually, so Claire and I went to the same high school, and actually Margaret, we all went to the same high school, and I had a high school English teacher, my creative writing teacher there, who is really the reason why I am a writer now, Jim Connolly, and I actually dedicated my poetry collection to him because I started off life as a poet. And so he was really instrumental in my sort of thinking about writing and how I think about writing. And I remember him talking about expressing common feelings in an uncommon way. And so I often think about that. And I often think about sort of these complex ideas and how to sort of best approach them, and really putting into poetry, you're trying to streamline and just pick the absolute bare minimum words you need. And then obviously in the space of this novel, there's so many more words, but I'm really trying to do the same thing, which is convey the most emotion in the simplest and most elegant and meaningful way. And so I really come back to, finding meaning and finding common thoughts and feelings, but expressing them in a way that maybe, or describing them in a way that people haven't considered before.
That's wonderful advice, and something that you do beautifully in this book. Thank you. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you.
Claire, thank you. Thank you both. It's been a pleasure hearing from you about the art of writing fiction and historical fiction. We have so many questions that have come in, and I'm just so sorry we can't address all of them. But what a great portrait you've painted for us of Mrs. Gardner, and what an amazing Boston woman and a collector. As we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration series, we've asked Emily to read from her novel to give us a last impression. So over to you.
So the two here, I'm just going to read just a very, very short piece, but just a refresher. The two characters here are poet and educator Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who wrote Paul Revere's Ride, and Charles Eliot Norton, who I mentioned before was the first professor of art history at Harvard. The two of them have just translated Dante for the first time, and Isabella is visiting with them. After Henry Wadsworth Longfellow left the room, Mr. Charles Eliot Norton handed me the newly bound book he had just translated, Dante's The Divine Tragedy. Here begins a new life, I read aloud as I traced both men's names on the cover. Keep it, he said. Being with books suits you. I accepted the book and his warmth. I had no such luck as my husband or you attending Harvard, I said. I'm having to educate myself.
And who isn't having to educate themselves? And what a great role model she was for all of us getting educated in diverse ways. Thank you so much, Emily, and talking about three dynamos in Boston's literary history. I mean, I love that you end with books, with reading and translation across times and cultures, which is really what you're up to right now. And thank you for that window into a life and a time. Special thanks to guest authors Emily and Claire for this illuminating evening. And thanks to the GBH Forum Network for all that they do behind the scenes, Andrew and Frederique. Kristen and Andrew of the BPL, thank you also. And to our audience out there in Zoom land, there were around 800 of you tonight, which is really stunning and says a lot about Boston and Isabella Stewart Gardner and you, Emily, and you, Claire. But to you out there in Zoom land, thank you. We appreciate your interest in America's history in all of its diversity, and we wish you a good night, and we hope you'll join us again. Thank you.